Imagine, it's October 21st, 1805. You are standing on the deck of a massive wooden warship. 27 British ships cut through the waves toward a combined French and Spanish fleet. The air reeks of salt, gunpowder, and fear, and in a few moments, you'll witness one of the most decisive battles in history. But here's the twist: your admiral just broke every rule in the book. Instead of forming the traditional line of battle, he's splitting the fleet in two, and charging straight into enemy fire. It's either genius, or suicide. Tonight, we're traveling back to an era that shaped the modern world more than almost any other. The Age of Sail. For 3 centuries, wooden ships powered only by wind determined which nations would become empires and which would fade into obscurity. Battles fought on rolling waves decided the fate of continents. Single ships carrying a few hundred men could alter the course of history. This wasn't warfare as we know it today. No missiles fired from 1,000 miles away. No radar, no radio, no engines. Just wood, canvas, iron, and human courage. Ships would sail so close to each other that sailors could see the faces of the men they were trying to kill. Battles lasted for hours, the air thick with smoke, the decks slick with blood, the sound of cannon fire so constant it became like thunder that never ended. Take a slow breath. Because we're about to step into a world where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of the wind. Where pirates ruled Caribbean waters and naval empires sent fleets around the globe. Where a single tactical decision made in the chaos of battle could save a nation or doom it. We'll stand on the deck of HMS Victory as Admiral Nelson leads his fleet to glory and meets his death in the same moment. We'll sail with Blackbeard through the waters of the Carolina coast, his beard smoking with fuses, his reputation more terrifying than his cannon. We'll witness the Spanish Armada, the largest naval force ever assembled, sailing toward England in a crescent formation that stretches for miles, only to be scattered by fire ships in the night and destroyed by storms that seem sent by the gods themselves. But we'll also discover the quieter truths. What it was really like to live for months on a wooden ship, sleeping in a hammock 14 inches wide, eating weevil-infested biscuits, knowing that disease might kill you before any enemy could. The strange democracy of pirate ships, where crews voted on their captains. The evolution of naval tactics from crude ship ramming to the elegant, deadly choreography of the line of battle. The ocean has always held humanity in a strange balance between wonder and terror. During the Age of Sail, it became something more, a vast battlefield where empires fought for dominance, where individual ships became legends, where the map of the world was redrawn by men who'd learned to harness the wind. And the remarkable thing? They did all of this without any of the technology we take for granted. No GPS, just the stars and a sextant. No weather forecasts, just a sailor's ability to read the sky. No engines, just the wind, which could disappear for weeks, leaving ships stranded on a glassy sea under a burning sun. So settle in. Let your mind drift backward through time. Let the gentle rhythm of waves begin to rock you. There's something deeply calming about the sea at night, isn't there? The endless movement. The sound of water against a hull. The creak of timber and rope. Tonight, we're going to let that rhythm carry us through 3 centuries of history. Through the greatest naval battles ever fought. Through the lives of admirals and ordinary sailors. Through moments of triumph and disaster, courage and terror, strategy and chaos. The age of sail is waiting for us. Let's begin our voyage. To understand the great naval battles of the age of sail, we need to go back even further, to the very beginning. Picture the Mediterranean in the late 15th century. Small kingdoms and city-states dotted the coastlines, each one jealously guarding its ports and trade routes. Ships were still relatively simple then, galleys powered by oars and a single sail, carrying merchants and soldiers across familiar waters. But something was changing. In the shipyards of Portugal and Spain, craftsmen were experimenting with new designs. They lengthened the hulls, added more masts, created ships that could venture far beyond the sight of land, into the vast Atlantic where dragons supposedly lurked in the depths. These were the caravels and carracks, ships that would change everything. The caravel, light and maneuverable, with triangular lateen sails that could catch wind from almost any direction. The carrack, larger and sturdier, capable of carrying heavy cannon and supplies for months at sea. It's remarkable, really, when you think about it. These ships were built entirely from wood, iron, rope, and canvas. No engines, no GPS, no weather satellites. Just human ingenuity, wind, and the stars. And yet they would carry explorers around the entire world. By the early 1500s, European powers realized something crucial: whoever controlled the seas would control global trade. And whoever controlled global trade would become wealthy beyond imagination. The race was on. Spain took an early lead. Their treasure fleets, the famous flotas, sailed annually from the Americas back to Seville, hulls weighted down with silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from the Aztec and Incan empires, and exotic goods that Europeans had never seen before. These fleets were so valuable that they traveled in large convoys, protected by warships called galleons. The Spanish galleon, now there was a ship. 3 or 4 masts, towering high above the waterline. Multiple decks bristling with cannon. A high forecastle and stern castle that made them look like floating fortresses. They were slower than some other designs, but formidable in battle. Other nations watched Spain's growing wealth with a mixture of envy and ambition. England, France, and the Dutch Republic began building their own ocean-going fleets. The age of exploration became, inevitably, an age of conflict. The ocean, once a barrier separating civilizations, had become a battlefield. And the weapons of that battlefield were these magnificent ships, each one a complex machine requiring hundreds of men to sail and fight, each one representing years of labor and enormous expense. Let your mind drift for a moment. Imagine standing on the deck of one of these ships. Feel the wood beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless sailors before you. Smell the salt spray, the tar used to seal the planks, the hemp of the rigging. Hear the creak of the masts, the snap of canvas catching wind. This was the world that set the stage for some of history's most dramatic naval encounters. The year is 1588. For decades, tensions have been building between Spain and England. Spain, the dominant Catholic power in Europe, sees Protestant England as both a religious threat and an economic rival. English privateers, essentially legal pirates, have been raiding Spanish treasure ships and ports in the Americas. The Spanish king, Philip II, has finally had enough. He orders the assembly of the largest naval force ever seen, the Spanish Armada. The plan is straightforward, at least on paper. The Armada will sail north through the English Channel, rendezvous with Spanish troops in the Netherlands, and transport them across the narrow sea to invade England itself. In the spring of 1588, the Armada gathers in Lisbon. 130 ships. 30,000 men. It's an overwhelming force, a floating army that seems unstoppable. The ships are loaded with supplies, weapons, and even siege equipment for the conquest of London. But naval warfare is never simple. And the English have been preparing too. The English fleet is smaller, but it has advantages the Spanish don't fully appreciate. English galleons are newer designs, sleeker, faster, more maneuverable. They sit lower in the water, making them harder targets. And crucially, their cannon are mounted differently, emphasizing long-range accuracy rather than the close-quarters boarding actions that Spain prefers. The English strategy is built around a simple insight: they don't need to sink the entire armada. They just need to prevent it from landing troops on English soil. In July, the Armada enters the English Channel. It's a sight that must have been both beautiful and terrifying. 130 ships in a tight crescent formation, sails billowing, flags streaming, stretching across miles of water. Fishermen along the coast run to shore, ringing church bells to sound the alarm. The Spanish are coming. The English fleet shadows them, staying just out of range. The Spanish commanders grow frustrated. They want to close distance, to grapple with the English ships and board them, the traditional method of naval combat. But the English refuse to cooperate. They dart in, fire their cannon at range, and dance away before the Spanish can respond. It's exhausting to imagine days of this cat-and-mouse chase up the channel. The constant tension, the periodic eruptions of cannon fire that send iron balls crashing through wooden hulls. The smoke, the chaos, the wounded being carried below decks. The Armada reaches Calais, on the French coast, and anchors. They're waiting for the Spanish army in the Netherlands to be ready. It's a moment of vulnerability. And the English exploit it brilliantly. In the dead of night, they load 8 old ships with anything flammable: pitch, tar, gunpowder. They set these fire ships ablaze and let the wind and current carry them directly into the anchored armada. Imagine being a Spanish sailor, trying to sleep after days of battle, and suddenly seeing flames on the water, drifting closer. Panic spreads faster than fire. Ships cut their anchor cables and scatter in the darkness. The careful formation breaks apart. The next morning, the English attack in force. The Battle of Gravelines is chaotic and brutal. Cannon roar continuously. Ships circle each other in the smoke. The Spanish fight bravely, but they're disorganized now, and the English capitalize on every mistake. And then the weather intervenes, as it so often does in naval warfare. Strong winds blow the battered armada northward, away from the French coast, away from the waiting army. The invasion is impossible now. The Spanish have no choice but to try to sail home. But there's no sailing back through the English Channel with hostile ships waiting. So they take the long way around, north past Scotland, then south along the wild western coast of Ireland. It's a nightmare journey. Storms batter the fleet. Ships run out of food and water. Some are wrecked on rocky shores. Others simply disappear in the tempests. Of the 130 ships that left Spain, only about 60 make it home. 15,000 men are lost. The defeat of the Spanish Armada doesn't end Spanish power overnight. Spain will remain formidable for decades. But it marks a turning point. England has proven that naval warfare is evolving. Speed and gunnery matter more than sheer size. The age of the lumbering floating fortress is ending. The age of the sleek warship is beginning. Rest for a moment in this knowledge, that even the mightiest fleets can be undone by strategy, weather, and fortune. The sea respects no one. Before we continue with more battles, let's slow down and spend some time understanding what life was actually like aboard these ships. Because the great naval battles, dramatic as they were, occupied only tiny fractions of a sailor's life. Most of the time, life at sea was simply hard. A typical warship from the age of sail, what came to be called a ship of the line, was a cramped, uncomfortable, often unpleasant place to live. Let's walk through it together. These ships were built for war, not comfort. A large ship of the line might be 200 feet long and carry anywhere from 500 to over 800 men. Imagine that. 800 people living in a wooden structure the size of a modest apartment building, floating on the ocean for months at a time. The ordinary sailors lived on the lowest gun decks, where the largest cannon were housed. They slept in hammocks strung between the guns, swaying with the motion of the ship. Each man had about 14 inches of space. When rough seas came, they'd wake to the sound of cannon rolling against their restraints, and the very real danger of being crushed. There were no private quarters except for the officers. No privacy at all, really. Men ate, slept, and lived alongside each other constantly. The smell must have been overwhelming, hundreds of unwashed bodies, bilge water sloshing in the hold, livestock kept below decks for fresh meat, the ever-present scent of tar and gunpowder. Food was monotonous and often spoiled. The basic diet was salt pork or beef, ship's biscuit, a hard cracker that could keep for months but was often infested with weevils, dried peas, and beer or rum. Fresh fruits and vegetables lasted only the first few days of a voyage. After that, it was preserved food or nothing. This is why scurvy became such a killer. Vitamin C deficiency. Your gums swell and bleed, your teeth fall out, old wounds reopen, you become weak and delirious. On long voyages, scurvy could kill more men than enemy action. It wasn't until the late 1700s that the Royal Navy discovered that citrus fruit could prevent it, which is why British sailors came to be called limeys. Work aboard ship was relentless. Sails constantly needed adjusting. Rigging needed mending. Decks needed holystoning, scrubbing with blocks of sandstone to keep them clean. Pumps needed manning to keep the ship from slowly sinking, because these wooden vessels always leaked to some degree. And then there was gunnery practice. A well-trained crew could fire, reload, and fire again in about 90 seconds. That might not sound impressive until you understand what was involved. Each gun, and a large ship might have over 100, weighed several tons. After firing, it would recoil violently backward, restrained by heavy ropes. The crew had to sponge out the barrel to extinguish any burning residue, reload the powder charge, ram in the cannonball, haul the massive gun back into position, aim it, and fire again. All in a minute and a half. All while under enemy fire. All while the ship was rolling and pitching in the waves. The best gun crews took enormous pride in their speed and accuracy. In battle, it could mean the difference between victory and death. Officers had it better, of course. The captain had a cabin at the stern with actual windows, the gallery windows you can see in paintings of these ships. He'd have furniture, room to move around, perhaps books and charts. Senior officers had small cabins. Junior officers might share cramped wardrooms. But even for officers, life was uncertain. Disease could strike anyone. A storm could send anyone overboard. And in battle, cannonballs didn't discriminate between a captain and a cabin boy. There's something almost meditative about imagining this life, isn't there? The routine of it. The endless cycle of the watch system, 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off, around the clock. The bells that marked each half hour. The ritual of the noon sighting, when officers would use sextants to measure the sun's angle and calculate the ship's position. At night, below decks, it would be dark except for a few carefully shielded lanterns, fire being one of the greatest fears aboard a wooden ship. You'd hear the creak of timbers, the slosh of water against the hull, the snoring of hundreds of men, the scurrying of rats. Always rats. Every ship had them. And yet, despite all the hardship, men chose this life. Some were pressed into service, essentially kidnapped, but many volunteered. The promise of prize money from captured enemy ships, the adventure of seeing distant lands, the escape from poverty or boredom on land, these were powerful motivators. The sea called to them, as it has called to humans for thousands of years. And once you'd spent years aboard ship, land could feel wrong. Too still. Too solid. Many sailors found they couldn't sleep in a bed that didn't rock, couldn't feel comfortable in a room that didn't sway. Let these images settle in your mind, the life aboard these vessels. The mundane and the extraordinary intertwined. Because when battle came, it was these ordinary men, cold, hungry, homesick, who would stand at their guns and fight with extraordinary courage. October 21st, 1805. Off the southwest coast of Spain, near Cape Trafalgar. The Napoleonic Wars are raging across Europe, and Britain stands alone against the French Empire and its Spanish allies. The key to Britain's survival is simple: maintain control of the seas. If the French can gain naval superiority, even briefly, they could invade Britain. The French and Spanish have assembled a combined fleet of 33 ships of the line under the command of French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve. It's a formidable force, sailing from Cadiz toward the Mediterranean. Waiting for them is the British Mediterranean Fleet, 27 ships under the command of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson is already a legend by this point. He's won spectacular victories at the Nile and Copenhagen. He's lost an arm and the sight in one eye in battle. And he's developed revolutionary tactics for naval warfare. Traditional naval tactics of the era were, well, traditional. 2 fleets would sail parallel to each other in long lines, hence, ships of the line, and exchange broadsides. It was methodical, relatively safe, and rarely decisive. Battles could go on for hours with both sides suffering damage but neither achieving a knockout blow. Nelson hates this approach. He wants decisive victories, not stalemates. So he's planned something audacious. As the sun rises on October 21st, the 2 fleets spot each other. The Franco-Spanish fleet is sailing in a curved line, trying to return to Cadiz. Nelson's fleet is approaching from the west, with a gentle wind pushing them forward. Nelson divides his fleet into two columns. One, led by Admiral Collingwood in the ship Royal Sovereign, will strike the rear of the enemy line. The other, led by Nelson himself in the HMS Victory, will cut through the center. It's the opposite of traditional tactics. Instead of fighting at a distance, Nelson is deliberately sailing directly toward the enemy guns. This is terrifically dangerous. As the British columns approach, the French and Spanish can fire at them with relative impunity. The British can't return fire effectively because only their forward guns, bow chasers, can bear on the enemy. For 30 minutes, maybe longer, the British ships must simply absorb punishment as they close the distance. Imagine being aboard Victory during that approach. The ship is 227 feet long, weighs over 3,500 tons, carries 104 guns and a crew of over 800. It's one of the most powerful warships ever built. But right now, as it crawls toward the enemy line, it's vulnerable. French and Spanish round shot begins to fall around the ship, sending up huge plumes of water. Then shots start hitting. Crashes as iron balls punch through oak planking. Screams as splinters, long, jagged wooden shards more dangerous than the cannon balls themselves, scythe through groups of men. Nelson is walking the quarterdeck in his admiral's uniform, clearly visible. His officers beg him to change into something less conspicuous, or at least to go below. He refuses. He wants his men to see him. Finally, after what must feel like hours, Victory smashes through the enemy line, breaking the Franco-Spanish formation. Now the battle becomes a close-range melee, exactly what Nelson wanted. British ships can bring their full broadsides to bear. Their superior gunnery training begins to tell. Victory finds itself entangled with the French ship Redoutable. The ships are so close their yards, the horizontal spars that hold the sails, are touching. Marines in the rigging of both ships fire muskets down onto the enemy decks. Grenades are thrown. It's brutal, intimate combat. And then, at around 1:15 p.m., a French sharpshooter in Redoutable's rigging, firing down onto Victory's deck, hits Nelson. The musket ball enters his left shoulder, passes through his spine, and lodges in his lower back. Nelson falls. He's carried below to the surgeon. He knows the wound is fatal, the paralysis is immediate. For the next 3 hours, as the battle rages above, Nelson lies in the dim, blood-soaked orlop deck, receiving reports of the battle's progress. The British are winning. Nelson's tactics are working perfectly. The Franco-Spanish fleet is being systematically destroyed. Ships are surrendering or being captured. Only a few manage to escape. At 4:30 p.m., Nelson dies. His last words, according to those present, are, "Thank God I have done my duty." When the battle ends, 19 Franco-Spanish ships have been captured or destroyed. Not a single British ship has been lost. It's one of the most decisive naval victories in history. But the cost has been high. Over 400 British sailors are dead, 1,600 wounded. The Franco-Spanish losses are catastrophic, about 4,500 dead, over 2,000 wounded, and 7,000 captured. The Battle of Trafalgar ensures British naval supremacy for the next century. Napoleon will never again seriously threaten to invade Britain. The Royal Navy will rule the waves, protecting British trade, projecting British power around the globe. And Nelson becomes something more than a hero, he becomes a legend. His body is preserved in a cask of brandy for the voyage home and eventually entombed in St. Paul's Cathedral. Trafalgar Square in London is named for the battle. His tactics are studied in naval academies worldwide. There's something deeply moving about Nelson's death, isn't there? To die in the moment of your greatest triumph, knowing you've saved your nation but unable to see the full fruits of your victory. To spend your last hours in the dark and noise below decks, while above, your plan unfolds exactly as you hoped. The sea gives, and the sea takes away. Let's shift our focus now to a different kind of naval warfare. Not the grand battles between nation-states, but the individual struggles between merchant ships and the raiders who preyed upon them. Pirates and privateers, two sides of a very thin coin. The difference between a pirate and a privateer was essentially paperwork. A privateer had a letter of marque from a government, giving them legal permission to attack enemy shipping during wartime. They were privately owned vessels functioning as part of a nation's war effort. A pirate had no such authorization and attacked anyone. But the line was fuzzy. Privateers sometimes exceeded their legal authority. Pirates occasionally claimed to be privateers. And some men switched back and forth between the two roles depending on whether their nation was at war or at peace. The Golden Age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, coincided with the height of the Age of Sail. And it makes sense why. The Caribbean and the Atlantic were filled with relatively slow, often lightly armed merchant ships carrying valuable cargoes. Colonial governments were weak. Naval patrols were sparse. The odds favored the attacker. Let's slow down and really imagine this world. Picture a small island in the Bahamas, perhaps Nassau in the early 1700s. For a time, it's effectively a pirate republic. No real government. No law except what the pirates themselves enforce. Ships come and go freely, carrying stolen goods to be divided among crews, traded, or sold. Life for pirates was hard but in some ways more equitable than life in regular society. Pirate crews were surprisingly democratic. Captains were elected and could be removed by vote. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon shares, with the captain and officers getting more but everyone getting something. There were written codes of conduct aboard many pirate ships, no fighting among crew members, no gambling, compensation for injuries received in battle. This was revolutionary for the time. Aboard naval vessels, discipline was maintained through brutal corporal punishment. Officers were aristocrats, sailors were commoners, and the distance between them was vast. But on a pirate ship, at least in theory, every man had a voice. The most successful pirates were brilliant tacticians. Take Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. He captured over 400 ships in a 3-year career, from 1719 to 1722. His success came from speed and surprise. He'd approach a merchant ship flying false colors, a friendly flag. Only when he was close would he raise the Jolly Roger and demand surrender. Most merchant ships surrendered immediately. Why fight? The cargo belonged to the ship's owner, not the crew. Sailors weren't paid enough to die protecting someone else's sugar or cloth. If they surrendered peacefully, pirates would typically take what they wanted and let the ship go. If they resisted, pirates might show no mercy, to encourage future victims to surrender quickly. The Jolly Roger itself, the black flag with skull and crossbones or other death symbols, was psychological warfare. It meant, surrender or die. Many pirates had their own variations. Blackbeard's flag showed a skeleton spearing a heart while toasting the devil. It was theater, but effective theater. Speaking of Blackbeard, let's spend a moment with Edward Teach, the most famous pirate in history. He operated from 1716 to 1718, primarily around the Carolinas and the Caribbean. He commanded a ship called Queen Anne's Revenge, which he'd captured and modified to carry 40 guns. Blackbeard cultivated a terrifying image. He was tall with a wild black beard that he'd allegedly weave slow-burning fuses into before battle, so smoke would rise from his face. He wore multiple pistols and swords. He projected an image of barely controlled violence. But here's the interesting thing, there's no historical record of Blackbeard actually killing anyone until his final battle. His reputation did the work for him. Ships saw his flag and surrendered. It was brilliant, really. Why risk your crew in battle when fear accomplishes the same thing? His end came in November 1718. The governor of Virginia sent 2 ships to hunt him down. They found Blackbeard anchored in a shallow inlet in North Carolina. A fierce battle ensued. Blackbeard fought like a demon. Accounts say he took 5 pistol shots and 20 sword wounds before he finally fell. His head was cut off and hung from the ship's bowsprit as proof of his death. But pirates were only half the story. Privateers were often more destructive because they had deeper pockets and better resources. During the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, American privateers captured over 1,300 British merchant ships. They crippled British trade and forced the Royal Navy to spread thin protecting convoys. One American privateer captain, Thomas Boyle, commanding the ship Chasseur, became famous for sailing into British waters and sending a notice to the British Lloyd's Insurance Company, declaring the entire British Isles under blockade by his single ship. It was satire. A single privateer couldn't blockade Britain, but it made a point about American naval audacity. The thing about privateers and pirates is that they remind us that not all naval warfare was nation against nation, fleet against fleet. Much of it was individual ship against individual ship, small dramas playing out on empty seas where the only witnesses were the participants. Imagine those encounters. A merchant captain, weeks from any port, seeing a strange sail on the horizon. Watching nervously as it gets closer. Trying to determine if it's friendly or hostile. Then seeing the black flag rise. The moment of decision, fight or surrender. The rapid negotiation at pistol point. The division of cargo. The mixed feelings of relief at being alive and humiliation at being helpless. Or from the other side, a privateer crew scanning the horizon for prey. The excitement when a sail is spotted. The chase. The tension of approaching, never quite sure if the merchant ship might have hidden guns, might be a trap. The moment of triumph when the prize is taken. The calculations of prize money each man would receive. These weren't abstractions. They were men making desperate choices in dangerous circumstances, trying to survive and perhaps prosper in a brutal world. As the age of sail progressed, navies became more efficient at suppressing piracy. By the 1830s, piracy in the Caribbean had been largely eliminated. Privateering lasted longer but gradually fell out of favor. An 1856 treaty, the Paris Declaration, abolished privateering in international law, though the United States notably didn't sign it. The romantic image of pirates we have today, the swashbuckling adventurer with a code of honor, that's mostly fiction. Real piracy was usually squalid and short. But there was something there, something that captured the imagination. The idea of freedom, of living by your own rules, of taking what you needed from those who had too much. Even if the reality was far less glamorous, the dream persisted. And in a way, it still persists today. Let that world fade now, the small ships, the brief encounters, the individual struggles. We'll move on to larger stages. Throughout our journey tonight, we've focused on specific battles and personalities. But let's take a step back now and think about how naval warfare itself evolved during the Age of Sail. How did admirals think about battle? How did tactics change? In the beginning, naval combat was essentially land combat transplanted onto floating platforms. Ships would grapple together, and soldiers would board the enemy vessel for hand-to-hand fighting. The ship was just transportation for the real fighters. But as cannon became more powerful and reliable, this changed. By the mid-1600s, the gun was the primary weapon. Ships were floating artillery platforms. The question became, how do you maximize your firepower while minimizing your vulnerability? The answer that emerged was the line of battle. All major warships, ships of the line, would sail in a single file, one behind the other. When parallel to an enemy fleet also sailing in line, both sides would fire their broadsides, all guns on one side of the ship, at each other. This formation made sense for several reasons. It concentrated firepower. It maintained discipline and command structure. It prevented ships from accidentally firing on friendly vessels. And it meant that even relatively inexperienced captains could follow simple instructions: stay in line, follow the ship ahead, fire when the enemy is abeam. The British developed this system to a high art. Their fighting instructions codified exactly how ships should maneuver in various situations. The emphasis was on maintaining the line at all costs. British admirals became experts at seizing the windward position, being upwind of the enemy, which gave them the ability to choose when to engage or disengage. But this system had drawbacks. Battles became stately, almost ritualistic affairs. Two lines would pound each other for hours with relatively inconclusive results. Aggressive action was discouraged. If a captain broke the line to pursue a particular enemy ship, he'd be court-martialed for disobeying orders, even if his action was successful. This led to one of the most controversial incidents in British naval history. In 1744, Admiral Thomas Matthews fought an inconclusive battle against a Franco-Spanish fleet off Toulon. The battle was chaotic and several British captains failed to properly support Matthews. In the aftermath, Matthews was court-martialed and dismissed. Several of his captains were also court-martialed. The message was clear: maintain the line, follow orders, don't take initiative. For decades afterward, British naval officers were cautious, perhaps overly so. The line of battle became doctrine, unquestioned and unyielding. Then came officers like Nelson who understood that while the line of battle was useful, it wasn't sacred. At the Battle of the Nile in 1798, Nelson attacked a French fleet anchored in a bay. Instead of engaging them in the traditional manner, he divided his force and attacked from both sides simultaneously, catching the French unprepared. It was devastatingly effective. At Trafalgar, as we discussed, Nelson abandoned the line entirely in favor of perpendicular attack columns. It worked because he had superior gunnery, superior ship handling, and because the shock value of the tactic disrupted enemy coordination. The French and Spanish had different tactical philosophies. French naval theory, influenced by thinkers like Sébastien-François Bigot de Morogues, emphasized maneuvering and preserving the fleet. The idea was that ships were valuable national resources and shouldn't be risked unnecessarily. So French captains often aimed their guns high, trying to disable enemy ships by destroying masts and rigging rather than hulling them below the waterline. The British approach was more brutal: fire at the hull, kill the crew, sink or capture the ship. This made British attacks more destructive but also meant British crews took heavier casualties. There's something almost chess-like about these tactical evolutions, isn't there? Each side trying to find advantages, developing counters to the opponent's strategies, experimenting with formations and maneuvers. And like chess, naval tactics had to account for three-dimensional thinking. You weren't just considering position on a flat plane but also wind direction, current, water depth, the state of your own ships and the enemy's. A brilliant tactician had to process all this information in real time, often through the smoke and chaos of battle, and make instant decisions that could mean victory or destruction. Consider the weather gauge, the windward position we mentioned earlier. If you were upwind of your enemy, you could control the engagement. You could sail down toward them to attack or maintain distance if you needed to. They, being downwind, had much less control. They couldn't easily sail toward you against the wind. So battles often began with both fleets maneuvering for the weather gauge, sometimes for hours before a shot was fired. It was like two boxers circling each other, each trying to establish advantageous position. Or consider the tactic of crossing the T, sailing perpendicular across the front of an enemy line. If you could achieve this, all your ships could fire broadsides at the lead enemy ships, while the enemy could only return fire with their forward-facing bow guns. It was every admiral's dream and rarely achievable in practice because the enemy would turn to avoid it. These tactical concepts sound abstract, and they are. But they played out in concrete terms: ships burning, men dying, careers made or destroyed based on decisions made in split seconds. As the age of sail progressed, ships became more standardized. Nations developed rating systems. A first-rate ship of the line had 100 or more guns on 3 decks. A sixth-rate was a small frigate with fewer than 30 guns. Each rate had specific roles in battle and in fleet operations. Frigates deserve special mention. They were smaller, faster ships, usually too light to stand in the line of battle but perfect for scouting, commerce raiding, and single-ship actions. Frigate captains had more independence than ships-of-the-line captains, and frigate actions, one-on-one battles between ships of roughly equal size, became legendary. The War of 1812 saw numerous frigate duels between American and British ships. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, became famous for defeating multiple British frigates in single combat. These battles captivated the public imagination in a way that large fleet action somehow didn't. There was something romantic about ship against ship, captain against captain. Let these images settle, the long lines of ships, sails full, flags flying, moving in stately formation across blue water. The sudden eruption of white smoke as broadsides are fired. The careful dance of maneuver and countermaneuver. The mathematical precision underlying what seems like chaos. Naval warfare in the Age of Sail was both art and science, requiring courage, knowledge, instinct, and luck in equal measure. Nothing lasts forever. By the mid-1800s, the Age of Sail was ending. The Industrial Revolution was transforming everything, including naval warfare. The first signs came early. In 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat Clermont successfully made a journey up the Hudson River in New York. It was slow, noisy, and primitive, but it proved that steam power could propel a vessel. More importantly, steam power didn't depend on wind. A steam ship could go in any direction regardless of wind, could maintain constant speed, could operate in calms that would leave sailing ships helpless. The military implications were obvious, though it took decades to fully realize them. Early steam engines were large, inefficient, and consumed huge amounts of coal. They were really only practical for riverine and coastal operations initially. But technology improved. By the 1840s, navies were experimenting with steam-powered warships. At first, these were hybrids, ships with both sails and steam engines. The sails were for cruising, to save coal. The steam was for combat, when you needed reliable maneuvering. The first major battle to demonstrate steam power's potential came in 1827 at Navarino, though ironically it was the last major battle fought entirely by sail. After that, the balance shifted. In 1854, during the Crimean War, the Russian fortress of Sevastopol was bombarded by a combined Anglo-French fleet that included steam-powered warships. The steam vessels could maintain precise positions for bombardment, something sailing ships struggled with. The advantage was clear. But the real death blow to wooden sailing warships came with armor. In 1859, France launched the Gloire, the first ocean-going ironclad warship. It had iron plates bolted to wooden hull. Britain responded in 1860 with HMS Warrior, fully iron-hulled and steam-powered. These ships made every wooden warship in the world obsolete overnight. The American Civil War accelerated these changes. The 1862 Battle of Hampton Roads saw the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, formerly USS Merrimack, fight the Union ironclad USS Monitor. Both ships were bizarre-looking, Virginia like a floating barn roof, Monitor like a raft with a revolving turret. But their 4-hour battle proved that wooden warships couldn't compete with armor. Imagine being a naval officer who'd spent 30 years mastering sail handling, understanding wind and weather, reading the sea. And then being told that all that knowledge was becoming obsolete. That future wars would be fought by ships that looked like nothing you'd ever seen, powered by engines instead of wind, armored against the very cannon that had ruled warfare for centuries. It must have felt like the end of the world. In a way, it was the end of their world. The last great sailing warships were beautiful in their twilight. By the 1850s, ship design had reached a kind of perfection. Ships like HMS Victory or the American USS Pennsylvania represented the culmination of 3 centuries of refinement. Every line, every spar, every sail was optimized. They were engineering marvels that happened to be gorgeous. But beauty and tradition couldn't compete with industrial efficiency. Navies began decommissioning their sailing warships. Some were converted to steam. Others became training vessels. Many were simply broken up, their timbers sold, their cannon melted down. The last sailing ship of the line in active service was probably the Austrian SMS Kaiser, which wasn't retired until 1871. After that, sail lingered on in smaller vessels, coastal craft, merchant ships, training vessels. But the age of the great sailing warship was over. There's a melancholy to this ending, isn't there? These magnificent ships had ruled the world's oceans for 300 years. They'd carried explorers to new continents, merchants to new markets, soldiers to distant wars. They'd been homes to millions of sailors. They'd been symbols of national pride and power. And then, in just a few decades, they became relics. Museum pieces. Memories. A few survive today. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, sits in dry dock in Portsmouth, England, carefully preserved. USS Constitution still floats in Boston Harbor. These ships are more than artifacts, they're tangible connections to that vanished world of wind and canvas. If you ever get the chance to board one of these ships, do it. Walk the decks. Stand at the great wheel. Look up at the masts towering overhead. Try to imagine them under full sail, cutting through ocean swells, spray flying from the bow. You'll feel the ghosts of that age. The midshipmen learning navigation. The sailors singing work songs as they hauled on lines. The officers scanning the horizon for sails. The smell of tar and salt and canvas. The creak of timber under strain. All of it gone now, except in memory and in stories like this one. As we near the end of our journey tonight, let's consider why the age of sail still captures our imagination. Why do we care about these old battles, these wooden ships, these long-dead sailors? Partly, it's the romance of it. The age of sail represents adventure in its purest form. Setting out across an unknown ocean with only the wind to carry you, navigating by the stars, facing storms and enemies with nothing but courage and skill. It's the stuff of legend. But there's more to it than romance. The age of sail shaped the modern world in profound ways. It was during this era that the world became truly connected. European ships reached every continent, mapped every coastline. For better and worse, often for worse, they brought different cultures into contact. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of crops, animals, diseases, and people between old and new worlds, happened because of these ships. The global economy we know today has its roots in this period. The concept of international trade, of supply chains spanning oceans, of markets that never sleep, all of this began with merchant ships sailing between continents during the Age of Sail. Naval power determined which nations would dominate this global system. Britain's century of Pax Britannica, from roughly 1815 to 1914, was built on Nelson's victories. The Royal Navy protected British merchant ships, suppressed piracy and the slave trade, projected British power into every corner of the world. Britannia rules the waves wasn't just a patriotic song, it was fact. American power today has similar foundations. After World War II, the United States Navy became the guarantor of global maritime trade. Different technology, aircraft carriers instead of ships of the line, but the same fundamental principle. Control the seas, control the world. The age of sail also refined concepts of strategy and tactics that remain relevant. The idea of force projection, using naval power to influence events far from home shores. The importance of logistics and supply lines. The value of intelligence and reconnaissance. The need to balance offense and defense, risk and caution. Military academies around the world still study Nelson's tactics, not because anyone will ever fight with sailing ships again, but because the underlying principles, concentration of force, seizing initiative, understanding your tools better than your opponent, these are timeless. On a human level, the age of sail reminds us of what people can accomplish with determination and ingenuity. These sailors lived in a world without engines, without electricity, without modern medicine, without instant communication. They couldn't call for help if something went wrong. They couldn't check weather forecasts. They had to rely on their skills, their experience, and each other. And yet they accomplished extraordinary things. They sailed completely around the world. They mapped coastlines with remarkable accuracy using just compasses and sextants. They survived storms that would terrify us today even in modern ships. They faced battle with a courage that's hard to comprehend. There's something deeply human in these stories. The fear and the courage. The ambition and the sacrifice. The moments of brilliant triumph and crushing defeat. The bonds formed between people who depend on each other for survival. In our modern world of GPS and weather satellites and instant communication, it's easy to forget how much harder things used to be. The age of sail reminds us. It shows us people confronting nature at its most powerful and emerging, sometimes, victorious. It also shows us the costs of that era. The colonial exploitation that followed in the wake of those exploring ships. The slave trade, carried out by ships whose design and construction we've admired in this story. The environmental destruction from whaling fleets. The countless ordinary sailors who died far from home for causes they barely understood. History is complicated. We can appreciate the skill and courage of age of sail sailors while also acknowledging the darker aspects of the system they served. But on this quiet night, as we prepare to end our journey, perhaps we can focus on the beauty of it. The beauty of a ship under full sail. The beauty of human beings working together to accomplish difficult things. The beauty of the ocean itself, vast and powerful and eternal. Our voyage is coming to an end now. We've traveled together across 3 centuries and countless nautical miles. We've witnessed great battles and quiet moments. We've met admirals and ordinary sailors. We've seen empires rise and fall on the turn of a tide. The age of sail is gone. Those ships are gone. Those sailors are gone. But something of them remains. In the museums where old warships rest. In the maritime traditions navies still maintain. In the stories we tell. In nights like this, when we let our minds drift back to that world of wood and canvas and wind. Perhaps, if you're lucky, you'll dream tonight of sailing ships. Of standing on a deck that rises and falls with the swell. Of seeing sails billow overhead like clouds. Of horizons that stretch forever, promising adventure and mystery. And in those dreams, you might understand, just for a moment, what it felt like to live in that age. To be part of that world. To trust your life to wind and waves and the skill of your fellow sailors. The sea is still there, of course. Still vast. Still powerful. Still mysterious. Ships still cross it, though they look nothing like the vessels we've talked about tonight. But the ocean itself hasn't changed. The same water that carried victory to Trafalgar still rolls against coastlines around the world. And something in us still responds to it. Still hears the call of the sea. Still dreams of distant horizons. Let yourself rest now. Let the gentle rocking motion of waves, real or imagined, carry you towards sleep. Let the images from tonight's journey fade softly, like ships disappearing over the horizon. Let the sound of wind in canvas, the creak of timber, the distant cry of seabirds, let it all become a lullaby. You're safe. You're warm. You're exactly where you need to be. The age of sail has ended, but the sea continues. The ships may change, but the ocean remains. And as long as there are oceans, and humans to sail upon them, something of that age will live on. Thank you for sailing with me tonight. Rest well. Dream of fair winds and following seas. Good night.